So the release of the redacted report showed the work of an investigation that took nearly 2 years. In an interview last night on Our Red and Blue, former White House lawyer for President Trump, Ty Cobb, reacted to the report.
I think the resulting report is, professional, thorough. He has probably 10 times the tools, if not 100 times the tools, to investigate than Congress does, and I don't think he could have done a more thorough job with the thousands of interviews, subpoenas, and the millions of documents reviewed, and the 500 witnesses that they talked to.
Also, for more on this, we are joined by CBSN political contributor Molly Hooper, as well as CBSN legal contributor and former assistant U.S. attorney for New York's Eastern District, Keir Dougall. Thank you so much. Okay, so now we've had a little bit of time to dig into this 400-page document where we're not on the air trying to sort of juggle things. I want to get your biggest takeaways. I'm going to start with you, Molly.
Well, the biggest takeaway is that there was no exoneration, and that's something. The reason I say that that's the biggest takeaway for me is because I cover Capitol Hill, and I sort of read this from the lens of an investigator on Capitol Hill and looking for those openings, because keep in mind you have 6 committees on the House side, Democrats are in the majority now, and they're all conducting investigations into some aspect of the Trump administration and the presidency. And Russia, of course, plays a role in that. And one congressman, Andre Carson, who's on the Intelligence Committee, he's not apt to put out fiery statements. He basically said, we're going to use this report as a resource. It's not a conclusion, it's just a resource to aid us in our ongoing investigations into foreign meddling and President Trump.
Right.
So that to me says that there's a lot of openings for Congress to take advantage of over the next year and a half.
Right. Keir, how about you?
So I think the thing that struck me the most is how, in connection with the Russian efforts to interfere with the election, how the conduct that Mueller found on the Russian side and the conduct on the American side and the Trump campaign side was so parallel, almost signaling to each other. Both had something to gain from this, but Mueller could not find that explicit agreement to conspire and to agree.
Right.
And so this is a lesson in the sort of the very classic and fundamental requirements of federal conspiracy law. But if you think back to the Bush-Gore campaign, when in preparation for the debates, the Gore team got this delivery of material that had obviously been stolen from the Bush campaign. It was prep material for the debates. And the person on the Gore campaign, when he received that, immediately recognized it and immediately called the FBI. And just to be extra safe, the Gore campaign then cut that person out of the debate prep to make it absolutely clear that the Gore campaign was not going to try to take advantage or benefit from some stolen material. And the Trump campaign folks, Papadopoulos, Manafort, Kushner, and Trump Jr., they did not do that. And so it's striking to me that how close on the Russian part of this that the campaign got.
So, in fact, the report identifies what they call 10 discrete acts, right, that were concerning. But let's go back a little bit so people can understand when you talk about obstruction of justice, because people are going to read these and think, wow, there's an awful lot of smoke. Why can't this be obstruction of justice? Even if it's not in relation to collusion with Russia, why isn't there a crime here?
Right. So let's just look at the one sort of historical analogy that we have, which is Nixon. What did they have in Nixon that Mueller doesn't have here? They had the tapes. They had Richard Nixon on tape basically admitting and directing the crime. So the elements of an obstruction, you need to have an obstructive act. The act has to be connected to the underlying investigation, and you have to have corrupt intent, which is the hardest, the very hardest part of this.
Right.
When you have a tape like with Nixon, it's almost indisputable that you can demonstrate the intent. Without that tape, it would have been John Dean versus Richard Nixon. In all of the examples, or in many of the examples that we have here, you would have had James Comey versus Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And a prosecutor, before deciding to go to trial, has to be prepared to prove beyond a reasonable doubt unanimously to a jury of 12. And effectively, what I think that means is the jury has to be able to vote for guilt and then go home and sleep well at night. For some of these acts, firing Comey, if it's done with the proper intent, it's a lawful act. The president has the authority to fire
anyone who works for him. Yeah.
Mr. Comey has said, I've seen him on the air, and he said, well, I thought that Donald Trump, the way he was speaking, was like a mob boss, and they speak in code.
Right.
Let him go.
But that's not proof.
Well, but that's subject to interpretation.
Right.
And when you bring a mob case, you've got two mobsters, one of whom has flipped. That's the sort of the classic case, and where the one of them has flipped and can testify, well, I was in this organization for decades, and I know exactly what the boss meant, right? Comey doesn't have that basis because he hasn't been surrounded by Trump.
Yeah.
Michael Cohen does. He testified to that in Congress. I know what he speaks in code. I know. But Mr. Cohen is a flawed witness.
Yeah.
So you see that the prosecutors here were faced with a extraordinarily tough choice about the quality of the evidence that they could have, and it's not satisfying. But particularly in a case of this stature, where you're proposing to charge, or you're contemplating charging the President of the United States. Potentially.
There's a high standard.
There's an extremely high standard, and you want the best evidence you can get.
So, Molly, to that, when we read the report, what we discovered there were a number of occasions in which, perhaps if people who work for the president followed his directions, there would have been a much stronger obstruction case. But instead, they chose not to do what he told them to do, including firing the deputy attorney general. But what does this say about this administration?
Well, let me go back to a point that Keir made about the Gore campaign. Yeah. Gore was a seasoned politician, respected politician. His dad was a senator. He knew campaigning in and out. He knew campaign laws. His staffers knew campaign laws. You get to 2016, Donald Trump has his son, who's a business guy, and some other sort of, it's kind of a motley crew, and I've heard that term from a Republican lawmaker. It was a motley crew of operatives who, they're scrappy, they're trying to get any information, any advantage that they can, and they're not thinking like a seasoned campaigner politician. So that kind of speaks to, the nervousness Republicans had when Donald Trump became president. But that nervousness was allayed when it was relieved when he appointed people like Jim Mattis, John Kelly as DHS secretary, and these individuals, Jeff Sessions, because Jeff Sessions, love him or hate his policies, he's a stand-up, honorable guy, and that's the one thing. I mean, he's very stand-up and law and order kind of guy, and if he doesn't think something's right, he's not going to do it, and he'll stick to his guns. And senators know that about him. I mean, having served in that body. So what it says is that Republicans were right to trust the people around Donald Trump to influence him to make the right choices at the end, to guide him in that direction. But now that there's sort of this house cleaning in the administration,
well, that's part of the reason I'm smirking, is because you're listing off a bunch of people who no longer work in the administration, and the people listed in the Mueller report who defied his orders. A lot of them aren't working in the administration either. We're just sort of touching the tip of the iceberg, but we have a long day of news. Molly, Keir, thank you so much.
Thank you.